Hi there. I'd like to talk to you about issues of resilience in the development community. Sustainable, resilient programs. And in order to do that, I'm going to go back to an analogy which is something that I've thought about since I was a kid at primary school. In my primary school, which is, we're talking 1950s Britain, every morning there was an assembly. And as well as singing a hymn, 100 and something little boys would be given a morally and spiritually uplifting talk. It was the last days of the Victorians, even though Victoria had died some 50 years previously. One of the people that was talked about was a very decent person, but sometimes thought of as a little controversial, and that is the great Albert Schweitzer, who received the Nobel Prize for his work in medicine in Gabon, in Africa. In fact, it was the Peace Prize that he got, but it was to do with his medical work. And he went basically into a very far-flung part, and he set up a small hospital. And he worked tirelessly. Many European doctors and nurses went and worked for 6 months, 9 months, a year, 18 months with him. He was consistent. He worked year after year doing medicine there. He started in the most elementary conditions, and he was at a time when huge strides were being made in medicine, because he went there before the First World War, but the First World War and the Second World War ushered in enormous changes, particularly to surgery in the European theatre. And Schweitzer was always going back to Europe and attending courses, giving lectures. He knew how European medicine was progressing, but he didn't change. And this is a picture of part of Lambarane now. And this is a picture inside his hospital in Lambarane. At no point during his time did he ever have a general anesthetic. He did all his surgery under local anesthetic, with all that meant: much longer times, much more difficult procedures, sometimes very difficult to tell whether sufficient of the locality had been anesthetized, etc., etc. Many people talked to him about updating his methods, becoming more modern, adapting with the times, and he consistently refused to do so. Yet he is a heroic figure, and he is a decent figure. And what was he doing? Why did he do it like that? Now, I don't have a definitive answer, but I've seen so many mistakes made in the development programs that I've seen out in the field that I'm going to have a guess. And so my interpretation, my personal interpretation of what Schweitzer was all about, has to do with sustainability and resilience. He was able to train, and he did train, African nurses and African paramedics, as we would call them, to be able to treat other Africans. And these people were largely illiterate. And I know from my time in East Timor, where 60, depending on the village where you went, 60 to 80% of the population was illiterate. Now, illiterate doesn't mean stupid. It doesn't mean unintelligent. It means uneducated, unable to read and write. But smart and good and capable and decent means all those things are possible. And I think that Schweitzer understood this. And he understood that if a community felt that it was helping others, and others would walk to get to Lambarane to be treated by Schweitzer, he understood that it was a beacon of hope and that it had to keep going. Now, what is the thing that you get when you have really sophisticated new medical procedures and equipment? Logistics becomes your nightmare. If you're in the middle of a really difficult to get to part of Africa, the last thing you do is take on serious logistics problems. And so having the solution suit the circumstances and listening, even if it's not in a direct, linear way to what the locals want and what the locals expect, is actually, in my opinion, a more resilient, a more sustainable, and absolutely a more human approach. Because it is rather a colonial approach for you to arrive and say, look, you poor people, I'm going to help you. You don't understand this. You haven't, been to Ivy League schools. You haven't been to Harvard. You haven't been to Oxford or Cambridge. You can't really be expected to understand what is going on. And that's a form of benign colonialism. It's got to be a much more even playing field. What do you want, and what kind of resources do you have to do that, and how can I help you? How can I enable you? How can I help you stretch your resources? How can I introduce tiny incremental change that is completely within your framework of understanding? That's the sort of thing that I think Schweitzer was getting at. He's a controversial figure nowadays. The fact of him refusing certain modern techniques is irrefutable. He refused. It's the why he refused that is probably never going to be really, really solved. But having felt on my own skin and seen that traditional societies do well with traditional mechanisms and traditional values and traditional abilities, sometimes us parachuting our ideas in is not really what they need. So what do we do with the Cynefin framework with this one? By the way, I call this the Lambarane challenge. In the obvious domain, our procedures and checklists, we have to remember to make that the start point, not the goal. It really is important that we use procedures and checklists where they're appropriate, but not that we try to turn everything into a procedure or a checklist. The programs that enhance resilience, even complicated ones, if they can be implemented, are always to be evaluated and looked at carefully and implemented if there really is a local demand for that service. But if there isn't, we must beware that the ability to bring complicated expertise from outside is not necessarily what is required. What is required is to help local people do the best they can with local things, and if they want to improve, if they want extra education, if they want extra technology, then you help them experience it and own it and have it. The kind of development challenges that we face out there in the real world are either slow onset or fast onset. A slow onset terrible disaster is something like a drought. It's seen coming, there's a bad planting, there's a bad harvest, the stocks are running out. We're talking months and months of slowly getting to somewhere. Classically, for drought, the World Food Programme has become great at trucking stuff where it's needed. However, the World Food Programme were not totally comfortable when it was suggested that for the once every 15 years mega drought, mega problem, they couldn't rely on trucks. They should switch to something much quicker and much more fungible, like insurance. Very difficult. Anyway, there is now set up a drought insurance capacity in Africa, and I would recommend that those of you who are interested in that go and look at it and ask yourself about these ways of addressing that sort of thing. The fast onset big disaster, the tsunami, you have days possibly, or hours maybe, and then you're doing cleanup. That is a chaotic event. We shouldn't kid ourselves, it's anything other than a chaotic event. And that is a development nightmare. because for chaos you can only have certain standby capabilities available. I have been lucky enough to work a little bit with the Caribbean Disaster Management Agency, and they are very aware that their emergency stores that they have on hand are big band-aids. They're big sticking plasters that they can rush within hours to the first fast onset disaster. And then they've just got to be nimble. They've got to use their contacts worldwide to support that, because they can't afford to have huge stockpiles. And besides, sometimes warehouses are things that are hit by the tsunami. So you have to be careful about that. But distributed systems and an understanding about slow onset, fast onset, where with slow onset, if it's going to be a really mega disaster, where you might not want to change your modalities. But all the time, you're thinking, your goal is, how do we make this community more resilient? And how do we make our support sustainable by them? And that really is the Lambarane challenge. And Schweitzer's still on my list of heroes, even though he's a problematic kind of guy. So that's really all I have to say about that.